got a new painting demo for you today, and we'll also talk about color mixing in the first part of this video. I'll show you how I mix flesh tones and what the guiding principles are. I'm gearing it more towards beginners because it's quite a detailed walkthrough, but I'm putting a lot into it and I believe it will be useful for you at whatever level you are. I made a small print to use as a real visual example we can study with. You can do the same. I've included a link in the description to download the image. However, please note that printed colors may look different, have a tint or a different depth than we see in real life. So it's not ideal to rely on it fully as a reference when painting. It can be a good exercise though in developing our ability to see, to identify colors more accurately. I'm using a traditional limited palette, more on that later. What I usually like to do is to premix a few tones for the portrait in advance, I call them base colors, and then adjust them to create more hues and tones from them during the painting process itself. We're going to do some version of it today. For this sketch, I'd probably premix one and create the rest of the colors on the go, but let's do two so that we could dive deeper. I want to share my thoughts, frameworks of how I think about mixing colors that I hope can help you, and especially people starting out. First, we need to identify a color we are trying to mix based on the reference. Choose a color that's quite dominant, something we can use to create more tones from later. Here we'll do this one, you can see it in many places, and then the one in this area. I start by throwing some colors together that I think can get me close to the desired tone, and then I adjust it if needed. So just take your best guess here, it's okay if it's off, you'll fix it in the next step. Once you mixed it, you can ask yourself a series of helpful questions to figure out the best way to adjust it. It may already match or be close to the color you're trying to mix. In that case, awesome. Otherwise, there are two types of questions you can ask. Questions about value, is it darker or lighter than needed? Or questions about hue. Let me quickly remind you that values refer to how dark or light the color is, and hues are the colors themselves, like red, blue, green, yellow. You can think of it as like a tint. So here, for example, is the paint color lighter or darker than the reference? It's darker, so we have to add more white. I am breaking it down to the very basics here. When you get used to it, you make decisions and these adjustments naturally. But sticking to the structured approach, let's ask questions about the hue. Is the paint color more or less yellow than the tone we're aiming for? If it's less, then add yellow. If it's more, then we need to add a complementary color. Complementary colors are pairs of colors that when mixed cancel each other out. They are placed on the opposite sides of the color wheel, so it can be very helpful to have one in front of you unless you have it memorized, because then we can see, okay, purple will neutralize yellow, green will tone down red, and so on. Right now I'm adding blue and red, which makes purple, but it's best to do it in small increments, adding a little bit at a time, step by step, especially because blue can be so overpowering. That's why I'm trying to be careful. I've decided to add a bit more white. I think now it's very close to it. I see this color in a few places, but I still feel like it can be lighter. And this will be good enough. Now let's do one more. The same way, we'll take some colors, put them together. I think I see this value somewhere there, but what about the hue? Is the paint color more or less yellow than the tone on the reference? It's less yellow, but let's say you're not sure. Is it more or less blue? It's definitely more blue, it's colder, and to tone down the blue, we have to add orange, which is yellow plus red, so let's take a little bit of yellow and red. Let's now make it a little bit lighter, and is it more or less red? I'd add a tiny bit of red, and that's it. You can mix any skin tone like this, and I think we're ready to do the sketch now. No need to make it too big, it's best to have it close to the real size, maybe a little bigger than real size. Very lightly. It's a bit difficult to put marks on this textured paper. I don't want to put too much pressure on the pencil. Like I said, I like to draw the initial sketch very lightly, and this way it's easy to erase the lines if needed, makes everything simpler. It's important to now establish the size of the eye itself. It's tilted to angling upwards like this if we were to imagine an axis. And so this would be the size. So this is the lower eyelid fold, or like a shadow area underneath the lower eyelid. Then here, this little dark circle is somewhere here. And then let's define the upper eyelid a little more and where the brow starts. Let's make sure the eyeliner doesn't go too far here, and the rest is fine to do in paint. I know that my sketch is probably barely visible to you on camera, but something like this is fine because it just has to give us the idea of the main sizes, proportions. Sometimes you can spend more time on the sketch, again, to ensure correct proportions and features, but it's also fine if you want to go and do the underpainting or to sketch with paint right away, completely fine as well and valid. When I start with a white surface, I like to tone it a little or do some underpainting. You can do a wash of burnt umber or burnt sienna, or alternatively tone it in advance using gray acrylic primer or gesso. Reason being, it's easier to see colors and specifically values this way rather than against a pure white surface that creates a huge contrast. That's why my palette is this neutral gray color as well. Admittedly, I went even lighter than I normally would, but that shouldn't be a problem. I'm starting with darks. This can aid in keeping it unified and allow you to see some forms, shapes from the beginning. I see a lot of warm, even red hues in her eye, but there is some blue tone around the iris. We'll need to pay close attention to hues and adjust the colors as needed. I believe capturing all the different hues and color changes makes portraits look much more realistic. For example, cheeks and nose can usually be a little warmer or more red, under eye area more purple or blue, creases, folds are usually more saturated. It's good to keep it in mind and then adjust the colors accordingly. So I'll be showing my approach and how I go about creating more tones from the ones we have on the palette right now. By the way, let me know if you want me to speak more about how I use medium, which is bleached linseed oil here. I don't use a lot of it. I like the consistency of this paint, so I barely have some medium on the brush. Occasionally, I dip a brush in medium before wiping it on a paper towel, as if I'm rinsing it off a certain color before picking up a new one that I don't want to be affected by the previous color. Simply speaking, it's a good way to clean a brush before changing the tone, or you can just switch to a different brush. You can use many brushes and switch between them in the process, with each brush being used for a different color group of sorts. For example, one brush is for some light tones, another for medium neutral tones, another for darker shades, and so on. This way it's easier to avoid polluting a new color with the paint that's left in the bristles. I hope that makes sense. We can already place some of it here. The crease is generally more red, but not too red. We don't want to overdo anything or overly define. Apart from making sure we have the right values, the right tones, if I think about it, we have two important tasks. One is to keep it soft. By that I mean not overly defined, outlined, or cartoonish. Notice how I like to paint with just the tip of the brush oftentimes, not putting pressure on it, leaving some brushwork. And secondly, we must maintain proportions, placements of features and sizes, adjusting them if something seems off. Especially when painting a whole face, there'll be lots of little revisions you might have to do to ensure symmetry and capture the likeness or resemblance if it's a portrait of a specific person. The darker colors that we've been placing from the beginning often seem especially dark at first, mainly because there is nothing to compare them with yet. Don't worry, this is normal. The darks may appear more intense against the white background, and we don't even have the darkest darks yet on the painting. We're just starting to establish some of the shadow areas, some of the iris. Burnt umber and blue make black. You can choose if you want a cold or warm black by adding more blue or more burnt umber. For example, the eyeliner on her top lid has a colder hue. This black is not as deep as you can get from, for example, using pure ivory black or lamp black straight out of the tube, but you rarely ever need such a dark value. And like I said, black can have warm or cool blue-like hues, and so I think creating a mixture is going to give you that much more flexibility, and it's very practical. Like I mentioned before, usually there are some blues along the iris. This can vary from person to person and lighting can affect it, but generally I've noticed this often. Right there at the transition, it's typically more blue. And this is how I use these mixtures from them. As you can see, we can easily mix tones for the white of the eye as well. We didn't need to premix it separately. We can just use these and a little bit of white and a little bit of blue. But be careful not to make the white of the eye too white, because in reality it's usually much darker value, darker than you would expect. Then the waterline going onto the lower eyelid is more like pinker, but we don't want to make it too pink because then the eye will look irritated. But I think it's close to this tone, so I see some highlights over here. Let's not exaggerate them. Keep them soft, natural. I actually like placing highlights. It can be kind of satisfying. This part of the eye, of the iris under the eyelid, is a lot darker on top. It's in the shadow. And then also here is where we have the eyeliner. We can't see too much of a separation there. It blends together for the most part, but at some places we can see the thickness of the eyelid, and it's better to show that, otherwise the anatomy will seem off. Sometimes you can wipe the brush on a paper towel and use it when it's practically dry to gently push the paint around carefully, very lightly. Be careful because the lines can move and shift when oil painting wet on wet. That's the name of the technique. It's also called alla prima. And it's a good thing on one hand because we can easily adjust everything. If something is a bit crooked or not in place, we'll push it in place like we talked about earlier. But because everything easily moves, you might be working on some area and not even notice how the proportions have drifted already. So keep an eye on that. Remember not to overwork any area and to view each element as a part of the whole rather than as separate. It helps to look at what you're painting in general, considering each part in relation to the other forms and shapes around it. Everything needs to tie together and unite, which is especially important when painting a portrait. Let me take a moment to talk about traditional limited palette. It's simple, it's great, especially even when you're starting out. As you progress, you can add more colors to it for convenience, or if you notice you mix the same color over and over again, you can just buy a similar shade to it. It'll save you time. Or maybe you have a certain style when you use a lot of blue and cooler shades, skin tones. You can add different blues, a purple, green. Green is great for creating cooler skin tones without the tone being overpowered by blue, since most blues, ultramarine blue in this case, is a very strong color. I personally have Terra Verde as a nice semi-transparent green, but I digress. Why start with this limited palette? Besides saving money, since you only need 5 colors instead of 10 or 12 or more, and oil paints can be costly depending on quality and brand, you'll also simplify the process for yourself. A significant part of oil painting is mixing colors, whether you premix some tones in advance or during the painting process itself. And if you're not a pro at it yet, it's easier to make decisions about which color to add when working with 5 colors, with one of them being white, so effectively 4 colors, than a dozen when you have to deal with their unique undertones and how transparent or opaque each one is. If you feel confident, you can add some alizarin crimson and or cadmium orange right away. This is essentially my everyday palette for painting portraits, with the exception of some cases. I occasionally like using pale rose and that green I already mentioned. But if you are just starting out, begin with the basics and gradually introduce new colors along the way. The thing is, this limited palette is very powerful on its own. With it, you'll be able to mix the vast majority of colors you see in the world around you, let alone skin tones of any kind. What it can't do is make colors that are brighter than themselves, some neon-like colors, super saturated and bright. Fortunately, such colors are rarely found in nature, but if you do need a color like that, you can buy it separately for that purpose. Another limitation of any paint, not just this palette, is that it can't replicate the colors you see on the screen. I've had people ask why the colors on a digital reference they are using look different from their painting no matter how they try, especially the bright or light areas. The colors of your painting will only be as bright as the physical medium allows, or more specifically, as light as your titanium white color. That's the end of the spectrum. On the other end, your black represents the darkest point, and you work within that range. It's worth mentioning that fresh paint is the best, even though oil paint dries slowly, and sometimes I continue working with the same palette the next day because it's still wet. Not all colors dry equally, and some of them become stiffer overnight. You can add a bit of medium to those colors to revive them, but it doesn't always work in terms of bringing them back to a perfect consistency. So using fresh paint is definitely the way to go for the best results. I like my paints to be creamy, not too stiff, but not too runny either. I don't use any paint thinners or solvents, by the way. I usually use bleached linseed oil as a medium, or sometimes refined safflower oil. I do enjoy using it as well. If you want the paint to dry quickly, you can use liquid or another fast-drying medium. However, painting portraits, I prefer the paint to stay wet longer. That's the beauty of oil paint. You can work with it and manipulate it, much like clay. It doesn't set in stone right away, making it a very forgiving medium. But sometimes I use liquid for other elements or parts of a painting that I do want to dry faster. I'd like to answer a couple of questions that I get a lot because I feel like it can be helpful. What type of paper do you use? I usually use paper from these brands, but there are alternative brands that are just as good. My favorite paper is 280 grams per square meter paper with linen texture. This particular one I'm painting on today is from Canson. Everything I'm mentioning is not sponsored. These are just things I like and use. Even though this paper is specifically made for oil painting, I still like to put a coat of gesso or acrylic primer before painting on it. Another question, I do the initial sketch, but my portrait ends up crooked. I'm not happy with the results. What am I doing wrong? Well, it's important to continuously check the proportions and symmetry of a portrait throughout the entire painting process, whether you did the initial sketch or didn't do. I mentioned before that it's not as simple to stick to the outlines when painting with oils as it is when drawing. It can also be a matter of correct or incorrect, in this case, values. Value refers to the darkness or lightness of a color. It's what creates the form and dimensions in our drawings and paintings, so it's very important to focus on as well. A big thing that I've learned over the years of painting is you gotta trust the process. When it finally clicks, it's incredibly satisfying. I should mention there are more painting tutorials and real-time, not sped-up painting demos on my Patreon page, so if you like my videos and tips, I'll see you there. Thanks to everyone who supports my page and makes it possible for me to spend time creating content for you. I'm pretty much gonna leave it at this. It's not perfect, but it's good enough, I believe. Now, you've probably heard this saying, we do not rise to the level of our expectations, we fall to the level of our training. In other words, while watching painting videos, learning theory, and getting inspired are valuable, true learning comes from hands-on experience. The fastest way to learn oil painting is to paint. I really hope this was helpful to you. Happy painting, and I'll see you all next time.